In the sweltering heat of the 12th century, the kingdom of Jerusalem stood as a lonely bastion in a sea of shifting desert sands. It was a realm forged in blood and iron, yet its fate rested not on the shoulders of a titan, but on a young boy. A boy whose body was slowly succumbing to the most feared curse of the ancient world. This is the story of Baldwin IV, the Leper King, a man who defied his own mortality to hold together a kingdom that was already beginning to crumble. To understand the tragedy of the Leper King, we must first look at the sunlit illusion of his youth. The year is 1170. Jerusalem is a city of blinding white stone and shimmering golden dust, a precarious Christian kingdom surrounded by an ocean of Islamic powers. In the royal courtyards, 9-year-old Prince Baldwin plays. He is a child of unparalleled promise, handsome, athletic, and fiercely intelligent. He runs, he laughs, and he spars with the sons of the high nobility. Watching from the cool shadows of the stone cloisters is William of Tyre, the kingdom's greatest scholar and the boy's personal tutor. William looks at the young prince with immense pride, seeing a golden future for a fragile kingdom. Baldwin learns languages quickly, remembers histories effortlessly, and rides horses with a natural, reckless grace. He possesses the posture of a conqueror. There is no hint, not even a whisper, of the nightmare brewing beneath his skin. But the golden illusion shattered during a routine game of boyhood bravado. The royal children were playing in the dirt, a rough-and-tumble sport where they tested each other's mettle by pinching and scratching each other's arms. It was a game designed to provoke tears, to see who would cry out first. One by one, the noble boys winced, whimpered, and withdrew. But when they turned on Baldwin, dug their fingernails deep into his flesh, and twisted, the prince did not flinch. He did not pull away. He simply smiled, his face completely blank, devoid of any reaction whatsoever. William of Tyre watched this from a distance. At first, the tutor was astonished by the boy's supernatural tolerance for pain. He thought it was a magnificent display of royal stoicism, a sign of a future warrior king. But as the days passed, and the games continued, William noticed something deeply unsettling. When Baldwin scraped his knees on the stone steps, he did not notice. When blood welled up from a deep cut on his arm, the boy looked at it with mild curiosity rather than agony. He was not being brave. He was completely numb. The palace doctors were summoned in absolute secrecy. The chamber was cold, lit only by the flickering orange glow of oil lamps that cast long, monstrous shadows across the damp stone walls. The royal physicians, the most skilled minds of the Latin East, examined the young prince's arm. They pricked his skin with iron needles. Nothing. They pressed burning coals close to his flesh. No reaction. The air in the room grew thick with a suffocating, silent dread. The diagnosis did not need to be spoken aloud. It was written in the terrified, pale faces of the old men. Leprosy. In the 12th century, this single word was a death sentence harsher than the executioner's axe. To the medieval mind, leprosy was not just a disease. It was the physical manifestation of sin, a curse directly from God. It was a living putrefaction, an illness that slowly devoured a human being from the inside out, melting flesh, blinding eyes, and rotting limbs until nothing was left but a breathing corpse. A commoner diagnosed with leprosy was stripped of their possessions, forced to wear a shroud, and banished to a colony to die in isolation, legally dead to the world. But this was not a commoner. This was the sole male heir to the holiest throne in Christendom. The boy who was meant to defend Jerusalem against the impending storm was already dead in the eyes of God and man, before his reign had even begun. In July of 1174, the fragile foundations of the Kingdom of Jerusalem suffered a devastating shock. King Amalric I succumbed to a sudden, violent dysentery, leaving behind a realm surrounded by enemies and an heir who was already physically decomposing. Baldwin was just 13 years old. At an age when most noble boys were learning the basics of chivalry and courtly romance, Baldwin was brought into the cold stone sanctuary of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to be anointed with holy oil and crowned King of Jerusalem. The ceremony was magnificent, yet steeped in a profound, unspoken horror. The crown of the Latin kingdom, forged for giant crusader lords, was visibly too large for the boy's head. It wobbled slightly as he walked, a heavy, gilded reminder of the impossible burden placed upon a child. To the gathered crowd, he looked like a tragic icon. He wore robes of the finest heavy silk, woven with threads of gold, but the luxurious fabric served a dark, functional purpose. It was wrapped tightly around his limbs to hide the early, weeping lesions and the patches of dead, pale skin that were already spreading across his torso. His hands, which should have been smooth, were encased in thick velvet and silk gloves, concealing the terrifying reality that his fingers were beginning to stiffen into permanent, claw-like contractions. He was led to the massive throne of gold and stone, a seat built for conquerors, and when he sat, his small, frail frame was swallowed by the sheer scale of it. He was a boy king holding a dying empire, trapped inside a body that was melting away. A boy king is a tragedy. A leper king is an invitation. The moment the holy oil dried on Baldwin's forehead, the royal court of Jerusalem transformed into a den of wolves. The high court was populated by some of the most ruthless, battle-hardened, and ambitious nobles in Christendom. Men who had crossed oceans not for God, but for land, title, and power. They looked at the young king sitting upon the throne, and they did not see a sovereign to be obeyed. They saw an expiration date. They saw a ticking clock. Because Baldwin had no hope of producing an heir, the question of who would succeed him became a vicious, shadow-drenched war. Men like Raymond III, the powerful Count of Tripoli, smiled warmly in the king's presence, offering words of fierce loyalty while secretly maneuvering to secure the regency and control the levers of the state. Later, figures like Guy of Lusignan, an arrogant, handsome newcomer from France, would arrive, courting the king's sister Sibylla, with eyes fixed firmly on the crown. The atmosphere in the royal palace grew thick with betrayal. Nobles gathered in quiet corners, whispering in the shadows, calculating exactly how many months the boy had left before the rot reached his heart. They watched his gait, noted every cough, and examined the way he held his cup, searching for signs of accelerating decay. Every bull before the throne was a lie. Every oath of fealty was a placeholder. The political sharks circled closer and closer, waiting for the young king to bleed out, entirely unaware that the boy they dismissed possessed a mind of sheer, unbreakable diamond. But while the vultures tore at the internal politics of the kingdom, an infinitely greater danger was consolidating beyond the frontier. Across the burning sands of the Levant, a name was being spoken in whispers that chilled the hearts of the Crusader lords, Salah ad-Din, known to the West as Saladin. He was not a mindless barbarian, nor was he the cartoon villain Western chroniclers often painted. Saladin was a visionary statesman, a devout intellectual, and a terrifyingly competent military genius. For decades, the Christian Crusaders had survived because the Muslim world was fractured. divided by bitter sectarian rivalries and warring regional emirs. Saladin achieved the impossible. He united them. From the wealthy Nile Delta of Egypt to the ancient trading hubs of Damascus and Syria, he forged a massive, unified Islamic empire that completely enveloped the Latin kingdom. He wielded an ocean of fanatically loyal warriors, a professional army of Mamluks, light cavalry and horse archers that moved like a shifting dune across the desert. Saladin looked across the border at Jerusalem, the holy city he considered his people's rightful heritage, and he saw a kingdom fractured by internal greed and ruled by a diseased 13-year-old boy who could barely hold a sword. To the great Sultan, the Leper King was not a legendary adversary. He was a minor, pathetic obstacle, a momentary speed bump on Saladin's inevitable march to reclaim the Holy Land. The vice was tightening around Jerusalem, its jaws closing from the north, south, and east. The storm was coming, and the boy king stood entirely alone in its path. By late November of 1177, the vice had closed. Saladin had crossed the border from Egypt with an overwhelming force of over 26,000 battle-hardened warriors. Confident, swift, and ruthless, the Sultan marched directly toward an undefended Jerusalem, leaving a trail of smoke and ash in his wake. The Crusader state was caught entirely unprepared. Most of its army was campaigning far to the north, leaving the holy city exposed to total annihilation. Baldwin, now 16 years old and fading rapidly, refused to hide behind his walls. He scraped together every single able-bodied man left in the kingdom. The final count was pathetic. Just 80 Templar knights, a few hundred local infantry, and the royal bodyguard. In total, barely 500 Christian knights stood against an unstoppable tsunami of 26,000. They intercepted Saladin's massive vanguard near a small hill known as Montgisard. As the Crusaders crest the ridge, they do not see an army, they see an ocean, a horizon of shimmering steel scimitars, fluttering banners, and thousands of polished shields reflecting the harsh desert sun. It was not a battle configuration. It was a slaughterhouse awaiting its victims. Every man on that ridge knew they were looking at their own graves. The Crusader line wavered. Men looked at the staggering odds, and the terror began to take root. They were outnumbered 50-1. Seeing his army on the absolute brink of a panicked retreat, the young king knew that numbers no longer mattered. Only a miracle would save them. Baldwin, whose legs were already semi-paralyzed from the leprosy, had to be helped down from his magnificent white war horse. His body was stiff, weak, and racked with agony. He commanded Albert, the Bishop of Bethlehem, to step forward and raise the kingdom's most sacred relic, the true cross. What happened next would be etched into the stone of history forever. The teenage king, wearing his royal armor, collapsed. He fell face first directly into the burning desert sand before the holy relic. He did not fall from a blow. He fell from desperation. In front of his hardened, cynical knights, the king began to weep. Through the cold slits of his helmet, tears mixed with dirt as he cried out to God, begging not for his own life, but for the survival of his people and the preservation of his city. It was a moment of terrifying vulnerability. The king was stripping away all royal pretense, laying bare his broken body and shattered soul before the heavens. The sight of their dying, deformed king sobbing in the dust did not demoralize his men. It electrified them. A profound, fanatical fury swept through the ranks. If their king could suffer like Christ, they would die like martyrs. They lifted him up. His legs could no longer grip the saddle. The guards took thick leather straps and bound his boots to the stirrups. They took his paralyzed, bandaged hands and tied them directly to the leather reins. They placed a heavy broadsword into his stiffened right glove. Baldwin was no longer just a man. He was a weapon of mass morale. He raised his sword. The silver mask caught the sun. He ordered the charge. It was absolute madness. 500 knights plunged down the ridge like a falling mountain, screaming their battle cries, hammering directly into the center of Saladin's overconfident, unstructured lines. The impact was cataclysmic. The Crusaders did not fight like men. They fought like demons possessed by a divine madness. At the tip of the spear rode the Leper King. He tore through the enemy ranks, a terrifying specter of death draped in royal silk, his bound hands guiding his warhorse straight into the teeth of Saladin's elite Mamluk bodyguard. The Saracens, shocked by the sheer ferocity of the assault and terrified by the sight of the masked king who felt no pain, began to break. The line collapsed. The unstoppable army was routed. Panic turned into a bloodbath. Saladin himself, watching his personal guard cut to pieces by a teenager who was falling apart, was forced to flee for his life, escaping across the desert on a swift racing camel with only a fraction of his men. Against all logic, against all physics, the boy king had achieved the impossible. The miracle of Montgisard was complete. The victory at Montgisard was a miracle of spirit, but the body is a cruel master. When the adrenaline faded and the banners were furled, Baldwin returned to the shadow-choked chambers of the royal palace. There, the war against Saladin was replaced by the silent, relentless war against his own biology. Leprosy in the 12th century was a slow, agonizing dissolution of the self. It did not kill with the swiftness of a blade. It peeled away humanity layer by layer. We must look past the myth of the warrior king to the gruesome reality of his daily existence. His extremities, the toes that once carried him into the fray, had long since withered into blackened necrotic stumps. The nerves that had once felt the rush of the wind were now entirely silent, leaving him trapped in a numb, physical void. A creeping, milky film began to cloud his vision, turning the vibrant world of Jerusalem into a blurred, shifting gray mist. And then there was the scent. Despite the desperate, frantic efforts of his servants to mask the odor of decaying flesh with mountains of burning myrrh, frankincense, and expensive Eastern perfumes, the sickly, cloying sweetness of rot clung to his presence. He was a monarch who lived in a state of permanent mourning for his own anatomy, enduring the slow, rotting decay that the world and his kingdom refused to acknowledge. How does a man rule when he is effectively a ghost? Baldwin's life became a claustrophobic ritual of intellect and willpower. He was often confined to his bed, obscured from the sight of even his most trusted advisers by heavy, flowing silk curtains. He sat in the darkness, listening to the muffled sounds of the city. He could no longer see clearly, his mind a diamond-hard fortress of clarity, trapped in a failing cage of dust. He dictated laws, signed treaties, and commanded armies from his sickbed, his voice strained and raspy, yet carrying the iron authority of a true sovereign. His scribes worked in a state of terrified awe. They recorded the words of a king who had transcended his own mortality. He understood the terrain of the Levant better than his generals, and he navigated the complex, shifting alliances of the East with a cold, calculating precision. While his body was consumed by the disease, his resolve only hardened. He was a man who had stared into the abyss of his own extinction and found that he did not blink. He was the anchor of Jerusalem, held in place by nothing more than the sheer, stubborn refusal to let his kingdom fall while he still drew breath. Yet, as his physical strength waned, the weight of his legacy began to crush him. Baldwin looked upon his sister, Sibylla, the only remaining hope for his dynasty, and saw a tragedy unfolding in real time. The court was obsessed with her remarriage, and the arrival of Guy of Lusignan was a catalyst for disaster. Guy was everything Baldwin was not: arrogant, physically perfect, dangerously incompetent, and driven by a thirst for glory that was uncoupled from any sense of duty. Baldwin saw the game clearly, the way Guy manipulated Sibylla, the way the opportunistic nobles pushed for their union to secure their own influence. He knew that if he handed the keys to the kingdom to Guy, he was sentencing his people to a catastrophe. But the king was dying. He could barely hold his own head up. The final, agonizing irony of Baldwin's life was that he had spent every waking moment fighting to save Jerusalem, only to realize he was leaving the city in the hands of fools who would squander everything he had bled for. It was a silent, suffocating despair, the knowledge that the heroics at Montgisard were merely a stay of execution, not a salvation. He was a man watching his life's work slowly burn, unable to reach out and extinguish the flames. By 1183, the stability Baldwin had cultivated with such agonizing effort was beginning to fray. The kingdom of Jerusalem, once a bastion of order, had devolved into a cauldron of fractured loyalties and short-sighted power grabs. At the center of this rot was Guy of Lusignan. Arrogant and reckless, Guy had managed to turn the delicate political balance of the Levant into a powder keg. Saladin, ever the opportunist and a master of timing, saw his chance. He laid a brutal, suffocating siege to the fortress of Kerak, the vital stronghold that controlled the trade routes and the movement of the Crusader armies. The castle was under relentless bombardment. Stones were pulverized. The walls groaned under the onslaught of flaming trebuchets, and the defenders were pushed to the edge of annihilation. Inside, the situation was catastrophic. The kingdom was on the verge of being cleaved in two, a direct consequence of the incompetent leadership Baldwin had been forced to endure. Jerusalem was trembling. The light of the Latin East was flickering, and, for the first time, it seemed that no human force could stop the encroaching darkness. Baldwin heard the news and made a decision that defied the limits of human biology. He could no longer sit a horse. He could not stand, let alone lead a charge. He was blind, his body ravaged by the terminal stages of his leprosy, his flesh failing him in every conceivable way. Yet he refused to let Kerak fall. He ordered his men to carry him to the front lines on a wooden litter. It was the ultimate display of stoic defiance. The army watched in a state of reverent shock as the litter was lifted. There was no king sitting tall on a war horse, no sword-flashing champion of the cross, only an emaciated, silent vessel of royal authority, a man who had long ago traded his life for his crown. As the procession moved toward the besieged fortress, the knights didn't just see a king. They saw a memento mori, a living reminder of the fragility of life and the unyielding nature of duty. His presence was not just a symbol, it was a weapon. The morale of the Crusader army, which had been fractured and despairing, began to coalesce into a singular, fanatical purpose. They were not fighting for Guy of Lusignan. They were not fighting for gold. They were fighting to defend the honor of the man who had given his entire life to the dust. Saladin stood on the high ground, his scouts reporting the arrival of the Crusader relief force. He expected a chaotic, disorganized rabble, easily crushed. Then he heard the reports. The king was there, the Leper King, the man who had humiliated him at Montgisard, the man who refused to die, who refused to break, and who seemed to be protected by a fate that defied the Sultan's own brilliance. Saladin watched the approach of the litter, that strange, silent, and terrifyingly patient object of royal defiance. The Sultan was a man of high intellect and deep honor. He understood the nature of power better than anyone in the East. He knew that to fight such a man, a king who had nothing left to lose, a king who had already conquered his own death, was a fool's errand. The victory would be hollow, and the cost would be a stain on his legacy. He saw the resolve of the Crusaders, galvanized by the proximity of their dying monarch, and he realized the tide had shifted. In an act of strategic grace, or perhaps superstitious awe, Saladin ordered the siege to be lifted. He struck his camp and withdrew his forces back into the desert, leaving the fortress of Kerak standing. It was the final, silent victory of the Leper King, a battle won without a single sword being drawn, a triumph of pure, indomitable presence over the might of an empire. In the spring of 1185, the long, excruciating winter of Baldwin's life finally broke. He was 24 years old. He did not die in the heat of battle, or under the standard of his enemies. He died in the quiet, stifling sanctity of his palace, surrounded by the shadows he had lived in for so long. The light of Jerusalem, the boy who had defied death itself, simply flickered out. There was no grand spectacle, no final heroic shout, only the profound, heavy silence of a man who had finally earned his rest. For 15 years, he had been a living contradiction, a corpse that walked, a dying king who commanded armies, and a rotting flesh that held together a crumbling kingdom. With his passing, the silver mask was laid aside. The burden was lifted. But as the king went to his grave, he took with him the only thing that had been keeping the walls of Jerusalem standing, his will. The collapse was almost immediate. Exactly what Baldwin had feared, what he had spent his agonizing final years trying to prevent, became a reality. Without the anchor of the Leper King, the ship of state drifted into the rocks. Guy of Lusignan, unchecked by Baldwin's iron hand, led the chivalry of Jerusalem into the desert at the horns of Hattin. It was a tactical suicide. In a single day of blood and fire, the Crusader army was obliterated, the true cross was captured, and the kingdom, that brittle, golden dream Baldwin had fought so hard to sustain, was shattered beyond repair. 2 years later, the gates of Jerusalem fell to Saladin, the Sultan, who had once been held back by the sheer, terrifying resolve of a teenage boy, now walked through the streets unopposed. The city changed hands, the banners were torn down, and the Latin kingdom vanished into the pages of history. It was a bitter, brutal validation of Baldwin's brilliance. His presence had been the only force preventing the inevitable. History is often written by the victors, but it is remembered by the legends. We look back at Baldwin IV, and it is easy to fixate on the disease, the horror, the mask, the rot, but to focus on his leprosy is to miss the entire point of his existence. He was a king who ruled for duty when he had every right to surrender to despair. He led charges when he could not walk. He held a kingdom together with nothing more than the terrifying aura of his own unbreakable spirit. He did not defeat the disease. No one defeats death, but he defeated the fate it tried to impose upon him. He lived a life of absolute, uncompromising stoicism, proving that a man's true stature is not determined by the health of his flesh, but by the fire that burns within his mind. Baldwin IV reminds us that we are defined not by the tragedies that befall our bodies, but by the relentless, quiet courage with which we refuse to surrender our souls.